Before courts, before written law, and before the state could present itself as the source of order, communities already lived inside rules. These rules did not begin as legal doctrine. They began as limits on confusion. A field could not be divided anew every season. A debt could not depend entirely on memory. A boundary could not be renegotiated each time it was crossed. A stored harvest, a marriage obligation, a compensation claim, or a measured weight required continuity beyond the immediate moment. Early rule systems formed wherever repeated life created repeated problems. Grain had to be counted. Water had to be assigned. Labor had to be coordinated. Injury had to be answered without producing endless retaliation. Exchange had to remain intelligible after the parties separated. These pressures did not require a theory of sovereignty. They required stable procedures. Before political authority could centralize rules, ordinary coordination had already made rules necessary. This is before logic, a history of rules before they were written. Rule systems were therefore older than centralized sovereignty. They were not yet the command of a state imposed on a population. They were patterns of constraint that allowed coordination before authority had been concentrated in one institution. A rule could exist as a remembered boundary, a customary payment, a fixed measure, a ritual obligation, or a recognized settlement after injury. Its stability came less from written enforcement than from repetition. Archaeological evidence from early Mesopotamia suggests that administrative practices preceded many surviving legal texts. Clay tokens, sealed containers, numerical impressions, and later tablets recorded quantities of grain, animals, labor, and goods. These devices did not express law in the later juridical sense. They expressed controlled memory. Once a quantity could be recorded, stored, transferred, and checked, a social relation could become procedural. Before the state, many rules were enforced through distributed pressure. Kin groups, households, councils, religious authorities, and local assemblies could regulate conduct without permanent, centralized administration. Conflict resolution often emphasized compensation, restoration, and prevention of escalation rather than uniform punishment. Injury could produce claims between families. Theft could produce restitution. Marriage could create obligations between groups. These were mechanisms for limiting disorder, where no impersonal legal apparatus existed. The boundary between law, custom, religion, and economy was often indistinct. A land boundary could be a technical measure, a social memory, and a sacred restriction at the same time. An oath could function as testimony, contract, and ritual constraint. A calendar could organize agriculture, ceremony, labor, and redistribution. Later categories separate these domains for analysis, but early rule systems often operated before such separations became institutionally stable. Measurement was one of the clearest forms of pre-state rule. A stable weight, a repeated volume, or a recognized boundary converted uncertainty into procedure. Exchange between strangers required more than trust. It required a shared expectation about units. A measure of barley, a weight of metal, or a marked parcel of land made comparison possible across transactions that did not depend on personal familiarity. Measurement did not remove fraud or conflict. It narrowed the space in which disagreement could occur. Trade made this constraint more visible. Merchants moving goods across distance depended on seals, witnesses, reputation, credit, and recognizable standards of value. Political control over routes could change, but exchange still required procedures that survived separation in space and time. A transaction had to remain intelligible after the parties had moved apart. The rule systems of commerce therefore operated through record-keeping and repeatability as much as through command. When early states developed, they did not create rule from nothing. They absorbed older constraints and reorganized them under centralized authority. Royal inscriptions and law collections presented rulers as guarantors of order. Many practices they formalized had deeper roots in custom, accounting, settlement, and household regulation. The Code of Ur-nammu is historically important because it makes rule visible as public authority. The later Code of Hammurabi extends this visibility into a more elaborate royal form. These collections were not modern legal codes in the full administrative sense. Scholarly interpretation varies on how directly they reflected courtroom practice. Everyday rule likely remained local, negotiated, and uneven. The difference between rule systems and states is not the difference between disorder and order. It is the difference between dispersed constraint and centralized command. Before the state, rules could bind conduct through memory, reciprocity, ritual, measure, and dependency. Under the state, these rules could be collected, standardized, written, and attached to officers with coercive power. Centralization increased scale, but it also introduced rigidity. These systems had limits. Custom could preserve hierarchy and inequality. Memory could be selective. Oral transmission could change over time. Material records could be controlled by specialists. Written rules could favor those able to access scribal institutions. Standard measures could be manipulated. Oaths could fail. Rule systems before the state were not neutral mechanisms. They stabilized social order. But the order stabilized was shaped by existing distributions of power, status, and resources. They also reveal a basic feature of logic before formal reasoning. Rules reduce the burden of deciding each case from the beginning. They convert repeated situations into recognizable forms. A debt, a boundary, an injury, a measure, an inheritance, or an oath becomes intelligible because it belongs to a procedure already known. This is not formal logic in the Aristotelian sense. It is practical regularity. It is the transformation of social uncertainty into repeatable constraint. The state later made this transformation more visible by attaching rules to offices, archives, inscriptions, and punishments. But the underlying pressure was older. Human groups needed continuity before they needed theories of sovereignty. They needed ways to remember, compare, assign, settle, and repeat. The earliest rule systems were independent solutions to the problem of maintaining order, where memory, trust, and force were each insufficient on their own. Rule systems before the state show that constraint does not require abstraction to begin operating. It can begin as a measure, a boundary, a stored quantity, a repeated settlement, or a remembered obligation. Formal law would later give these constraints a public language. Political authority would give them scale. But the earlier structure was already present. Order had begun to depend on rules before power had fully learned how to name them. Once rules stabilized conduct, they also began to stabilize judgment. A repeated settlement could become an expectation of fairness. A customary obligation could become a standard of responsibility. Before moral reasoning became explicit theory, It already operated through inherited constraints that shaped what a community treated as permissible, required, or excessive. In the next episode, we will examine moral reasoning as structured constraint,